in 2017, Dennis Venema and Scott McKnight, a theologian and a biologist who are theistic evolutionists or evolutionary creationists, as they sometimes call themselves, who believe that basically Adam and Eve never existed. And they have been very strongly promoting this view. And they wrote this book that they published in 2017, which basically said that belief in Adam and Eve is as outdated as belief in the geocentric model of the solar system. And this book was titled Adam and the Genome. And there was a dialogue that really, again, was sparked by this book that was published, and a lot of people read this book. And a number of Christians who are in the scientific community, especially some geneticists and biologists, really pressed them and said, well, does the scientific evidence really refute the existence of Adam and Eve? Have we really ruled out the possibility of Adam and Eve existing? And through this dialogue that took place on a discussion forum online, eventually Dennis Venema actually admitted, you know what? No, I'm paraphrasing here. I'm not directly quoting him, but he basically said, okay, you know what? You're right. The scientific evidence does not absolutely disallow for the existence of Adam and Eve, and this idea that human beings originally came from an initial pair of just two individuals.
Okay, everyone, welcome again to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. My name is Anthony Costello, the putative president of the Kirkwood Center, and I am joined today by our vice president, Lenny Esposito. Lenny, how are you this morning?
Doing well. Excited to be here and talking about these issues.
Okay, and today we have an excellent very obscure apologetics topic today. The origins or the historical Adam and Eve. And to talk about this, we have Casely Luskin, fellow at the Discovery Institute up in Seattle. Casey, how are you? How are you today?
I'm doing good. A little bit tired. Just got back from a long trip, but I'm doing good. How are you?
Yeah. We're doing good. I know you had a grand tour recently overseas it was South Africa, right?
South Africa and Kenya. Yeah, it was
South Africa and Kenya.
Long trip.
Okay, so spreading the word about intelligent design around the globe, to be sure. Casey, I think you're our third guest from the Discovery Institute now, and of course I met you what was it, about 2 months ago now at the briefing in Washington, D.C., which is an excellent weekend. So we've had Stephen Meyer on, we had Melissa Kane Travis on recently, and we're going to be talking about a paper that you wrote recently on different models of human origins and how these models specifically relate to the historical Adam and Eve. And to the biblical account in Genesis of the first man and first woman. And you've done a really good job in this paper, and we're going to link to this paper and really laying out kind of you come up with sort of 8 models that are out there right now, sort of on the table over a range from ones that take the biblical account more literally to ones that take it far more symbolically or figuratively, and several that are sort of in the middle, and how each sort of matches up with the current science of the day. And of course, we're certainly going to focus mainly in on some of the scientific issues as they relate to our theological commitments here. But before we get into that, why don't you just briefly tell us who you are, what's your role at Discovery Institute, and how you sort of got into this world of intelligent design and human origins.
Sure. So my name is Casely Luskin, and I am Associate Director at the Center for Science and Culture at Discovery Institute. Discovery Institute, we're a think tank, which means we sit around and think about things all day. We try to come up with ideas that we think will make the world a better place and are practical. And so we have a lot of different programs. We have programs dealing with transportation, technology, artificial intelligence, urban affairs, education, bioethics, leadership. But we're probably most well known for our work on the topic of origins And in that area, we sort of serve as I would say, the institutional home for the intelligent design community, or the intelligent design movement, as it's sometimes called. And many of the leading scientists involved in the scientific debate over Darwinian evolution and intelligent design are affiliated with us in one way or another. So my role at Discovery is that I'm associate director of our ID program. I do a lot of work managing scientific research. We have quite an active research program. I'm usually, behind by anywhere between 200 and 600 emails in my inbox. So there's a lot going on, very busy. But one of my personal interests is the topic of human origins. And this is an issue I've always been interested in since I got involved with the whole ID evolution debate. For me, I got involved with this topic when I was an undergraduate student at University of California, San Diego, taking a lot of courses in evolution, learning about the evolutionary viewpoint, but then on my own free time, reading books by ID proponents. The first book I read was Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe back in the late 90s when it first came out. And then I just kept reading books and I realized, gosh, there's this really interesting scientific debate over origins, but it's not being discussed in any of my classes. It was sort of being ignored by the vast majority of my professors. So some friends and I started a student club at UC San Diego called the Intelligent Design and Evolution Awareness, or IDEA Club for short, to try to allow students to have conversations that really were being left out of our courses. So that was how I got involved with this debate. But for me, the topic of human origins has always been of great interest, because I think that that's just something that is really where this issue, the rubber hits the road the most. Like, where did we come from? I mean, it's, the topic of evolution, intelligent design, of course, is very important on many different levels, but where did humans come from? And so in the mid 2000s, I ended up writing a review paper for a journal that Bill Dembski got going called Progress in Complexity, Information and Design. And I wrote this review essay, or this review article on the state of the science regarding human origins. And I just dove into the literature. I read all these scientific papers and I realized, gosh, in all of my classes, I've been taught that there's this very clear sequence of intermediate fossils leading from ape-like species to human-like species. But then when I dug into the technical literature, I realized that actually they would readily admit that there was large gaps in the hominid fossil record precisely that pertain to where the human-like body plan arises in the hominid fossil record. Sort of that key point where the human-like form arises, we didn't have fossils. We still don't have fossils documenting that evolution and that sort of transition from the supposed ape-like ancestors. So we can get into that, but for me, that was a really eye-opening experience to see this disconnect between what the technical literature was saying and what I had been taught and what sort of the public, discourse was saying. And so that really got me interested in this to research that more. And it just went downhill from there. I've done a lot of writing and interest and just my own personal research on this topic of human origin since that time.
That's interesting. I do have to note this. I took my family to Washington, D.C. on a trip several years ago, and we went through the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. And one thing I noticed was when you get to the human origins section, it seems to be the most edited and ever-changing aspect or area of the museum. I mean, they had plaques, and then the plaques had masking tape over them. They don't believe this anymore. And it was like they couldn't land on what actually the story was. And I just thought that was fascinating, that it's so hard for them to create this model, this moving target, given what we're continuing to find out.
Yeah, what you said, Lenny, is a really nice description of the field of paleoanthropology. There are so many opinions out there, so many different viewpoints. I think Jerry Coyne has this great comment where, this is sort of a paraphrase, but he says that paleoanthropology is distinguished as a field because there are more practitioners of the field than there are subjects of study. And because the field is so data poor, you get so many different opinions. And so even, if what you see at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, and Anthony and I were just there last in August, a couple months ago, what you see is the presentation of what many people believe. But for almost every viewpoint that is expressed, you can find mainstream researchers who would disagree with that. And in fact, some of what they say there is just flat wrong. Like we're probably not getting into this too much, but they say at the museum that human DNA is 98.8% similar to chimps. That is simply false. We've known that for a long time, that human DNA is far less than 98.8% similar to chimps. It's been heavily criticized in the scientific literature, that claim. So some of their stuff still needs to be, some masking tape pasted over it. It's still outdated.
Well, that's just to stay on this tack for a little bit. So I think you or John West, mentioned how it's the textbooks in the museums are sort of the last ones to sort of update their scientific presentation or articulations, right? And, but that's where most people go to get their scientific understanding or knowledge. I mean, that museum's obviously, for a lot of people walking in there, they're taking their kids in there, the families are there, they're going through there, and they're just going to read that and say, oh, this is the way it must have been, right? And the thing is, it's like, since it's so speculative, you would just want more honesty in your marketing, in a sense, where at least put in there, it is speculated that, or something like when you're presenting these things, that is at least sort of backs off of it being so dogmatically presented, right? Especially if then really every 5 or 6 years, you have to do the masking tape, rewrite your signs. And I mean, just put some language in there, like it seems to be the case or something. But it's presented pretty dogmatically, I think, at the end of, yeah.
Anthony, that's another great point. And I agree with you. Sorry, I mean to cut you out of that. I agree with you very much that there's definitely a very evangelical feel to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, especially when you get into the human origins wing. They are really, really pushing it hard. And, you're right. Museums are hard to update. The wheels of science turn slowly, but websites are easy to update. And I just went on humanorigins.si.edu, their Smithsonian, website on human origins. And right here it says, quote, "We are 98.8% genetically similar to chimpanzees," unquote. So it's right there on the website today as we speak. And,
that's
unfortunate.
Right. I mean, maybe 30 years ago, you had an excuse if you couldn't get your signage updated quickly, but with the website, so there's, and that's something too, where it's just like, I think that might even be in part because of the continued disconnect between philosophy and the sciences, where philosophers tend to at least be a little bit more careful in presenting their quote unquote conclusions about things using, more like it seems or one, but in the scientific realm, there's still this sort of attitude of certainty that I think leads a lot of people. It was clearly leads a lot of people astray.
I was talking to Frank Beckwith about this, and a few years ago, and he had made an interesting point that when people come up and throw that statistic at him, he says, well, okay, even if that's true, you're using a chemical yardstick to compare humans and chimpanzees. Why is that the yardstick you choose? I mean, if we go to a physics yardstick, the construction of molecules, we're 100% the same as chimpanzees. Of course, we're 100% the same as our table too. So what is it about DNA that makes that so compelling to say that we're nothing but animals? And again, it's a philosophical question that the scientists don't seem to broach.
Well, I agree with you guys 100%. I mean, why does any percent DNA tell us that we share a common ancestor with apes, or that we're just animals? There's no objective metric there. But anyway, sorry. Yeah.
Well, let's go into that. Let's use that to segue into the paper. So you mentioned, I think in the introduction of the paper, there was something that happened recently, I think back in maybe 10 or so years ago, that kind of launched something like a new quest for the historical atom. It eventually led to things like William Lane Craig's new book. Can you give us a brief account of what happened? I don't know how long, a few years ago, that sort of set a new kind of agenda for this, the investigation into the historical atom.
Sure. And by the way, sorry, I just got distracted there. 2 of my 3 bosses have called me 3 times in the last minute. So I didn't know if there was some emergency going on, but I think things are okay. People are waving at me through my window here. So I think there's no crisis going on. So what sort of sparked this conversation, Anthony, was it actually goes back to 2011. There was a big cover story in Christianity Today, and the cover story was titled "The Search for the Historical Atom." And you would think that, with a title like that, they were going to talk about, Christians in the scientific community who are finding evidence for Adam and Eve. It actually did the exact opposite. That title was a little bit of clickbait. It actually was highlighting evangelical thinkers and scientists who accept modern evolutionary biology and are skeptical that Adam and Eve ever existed. And so the article actually highlighted various evangelical scientists who reject the historical existence of Adam and Eve. And for example, it highlighted the views of Francis Collins, obviously a very eminent Christian geneticist, also an evangelical, who headed the Human Genome Project and wrote, of course, the very famous book, The Language of God, where he said that, modern humans basically originated from a population that numbered something like 10,000 individuals, not just two. So we never came from just two original individuals. And then there was also a number of scientists affiliated with BioLogos. At that time, BioLogos was a relatively new organization on the scene. Francis Collins founded BioLogos around 2007-ish as an advocacy group to promote the view that Christianity and evolution can be very wedded together in a very nice, easy marriage. And so it featured various BioLogos scientists, such as Dennis Venema, who were saying things like, let me see, I'm trying to find some quotes here, that our species was definitely never as small as two. Our species diverged as a population. The data are absolutely clear on that. And they quoted other evangelical scientists, basically saying, look, you can't believe in Adam and Eve based upon the evidence, especially the genetics data. In particular, they thought that the evidence from genetics took away any room to believe in Adam and Eve. So after this paper came out, this really sparked an intense conversation in the evangelical Christian community over whether or not, it is still scientifically reasonable to believe in Adam and Eve. And does the scientific evidence really take away any quote unquote wiggle room to believe in Adam and Eve? And so what happened was a number of different Christians in the scientific community then started to explore different models of reconciling the scientific evidence with belief in a traditional Adam and Eve. And they came up with different ways of doing this. Some models, I would say, to varying success, some models more successful than others, of reconciling the scientific evidence with sort of this traditional belief in Adam and Eve. But, just to give a little bit of a punchline before we get too far into this, in 2017, Dennis Venema and Scott McKnight, a theologian and a biologist who are theistic evolutionists or evolutionary creationists, as they sometimes call themselves, who believe that basically Adam and Eve never existed. And they have been very strongly promoting this view. And they wrote this book that they published in 2017, which basically said that belief in Adam and Eve is as outdated as belief in the geocentric model of the solar system. And this book was titled Adam and the Genome. And there was a dialogue that really, again, was sparked by this book that was published, and a lot of people read this book. And a number of Christians who are in the scientific community, especially some geneticists and biologists, really pressed them and said, well, does the scientific evidence really refute the existence of Adam and Eve? Have we really ruled out the possibility of Adam and Eve existing? And through this dialogue that took place on a discussion forum online, eventually Dennis Venema actually admitted, you know what? No, I'm paraphrasing here. I'm not directly quoting him, but he basically said, okay, you know what? You're right. The scientific evidence does not absolutely disallow for the existence of Adam and Eve, and this idea that human beings originally came from an initial pair of just two individuals. And so essentially what he admitted in this online discussion is that the central argument of their book was wrong, and that they had not shown through science that Adam and Eve were impossible to believe in. Well, this then opened up the doors to all kinds of new models. Okay, well, if Adam and Eve did exist, or they could have existed, then how far back could they have existed? Or could we have them existing relatively recently? And this led to a bunch of models. So for me, I wrote this article in Religion's Journal earlier this year because there's all these new models that have been explored by different people, and it's complicated. It's a bit confusing. Some of these models claim to be reconciling traditional beliefs with the science, but they really are not. And others, I think are trying to reconcile the science and the traditional beliefs with varying degrees of success. And so I wanted to write an article that helped people to make sense of all these different models of Adam and Eve and the science and sort of traditional Christian doctrines about human origins with what the scientific evidence is saying. I wanted to help people sort of navigate and sort through this really complicated field of all these different ideas and models that are out there.
Right. And it's a great article in doing that. And, these models are going to get more and more nuanced over time, right? So it's good to have, and I'm going to put up the charts, some of the charts that you created later in our conversation here, so that people can get a sense of that. And we'll link to those. You know, I want to say I remember that discussion forum chain that was going on between Venema. Was it Richard Buggs who was on there? I think Joshua Swamidass and Ann Gager. And I remember, you know, and I'm not a scientist or in any sense, but I remember trying to read as many of the back and forths. I read like hundreds, just trying to follow and pick up on whatever I could. And it was fast because it went on for thousands and thousands of comments back and forth between these 4 or 5 people. And at some point I gave up. I was like 3 or 4 days I spent just reading that thread, you know, trying to see where it was going to go. And now we kind of have where it's shaken out a bit. And as you said, now some of these models have newer models have been proposed based on that discussion that was occurring back in like 2017, right? Where it was
you're right.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, you're right, Anthony. That was a really long discussion thread. I didn't mean, super long. So many pages. Yeah. It was on the BioLogos discussion forum, and a lot of really quality thinkers were weighing in on both the evolution side and sort of non-evolutionary views. A lot of really quality people. And it was a very civil discussion. I really respected the way the discussion, folks on both sides were very civil, very engaged, trying to really take this issue seriously. And eventually, it was actually a geneticist in the UK named Richard Buggs who wrote to Venom. He said, you would do your readers a service if you wrote a blog to tell them now, as far as you're able, that present-day genomic diversity in humans does not preclude a bottleneck. That bottleneck would be Adam and Eve in the human lineage between approximately 700,000 and 7 million years ago. I think you owe this to them. And then Venema, this leading evangelical biologist who had been arguing against the existence of Adam and Eve, he was sort of leading the charge. He replied to Buggs saying, quote, "I've already agreed with this. You're welcome to publicize it." And you have to really dig through, you know, hundreds of pages to find this quote. But that really right there is one of the leading proponents against Adam and Eve, admitting that, no, it is possible for Adam and Eve to have existed. The argument in a nutshell was that modern day genetic diversity among humans is so great. We have so much genetic diversity that we can never have been reduced to just an initial pair of 2 individuals. We need to evolve from a population of thousands of individuals to account for this great diversity that we see among living humans and their DNA and in their genomes today. You need thousands of ancestors. We could never have come from just 2.
Many Adams and many Eves would have had to exist at some point in the past for us to explain the amount of genetic diversity we see today. That was the nut of the discussion, the center of the discussion there, right? And then what Buggs and others showed is, no, you can have the bottleneck, although we'll get into how long ago, how far back you have to go chronologically to get the bottleneck. Let me ask you on this. This is something that bugged me, no pun intended, when I was trying to read through those comments 5 or 6 years ago. What I couldn't conceptually understand, I guess, and it's just because I'm kind of a dummy on the issue, is how you could not have 2 at some point. Because what does it mean to have just a population of 12,000 all of a sudden who are all modern humans? Like, where I didn't quite understand how you account for the existence of 10 to 20,000 of these modern human creatures if they didn't have an ancestor of their own. Like, where is it like a polygenesis thing?
Yeah, even with modern evolutionary theory, you have somebody who's the fittest, right? In survival of you have somebody who had adapted a new genometric trait that's considered the fittest. So that's the progenitor of the newest lineage.
Yeah, it's always haunted me.
You guys are asking very reasonable question here that makes sense, because I mean, every population has to start from somewhere, right? It doesn't just group into 10,000 individuals. So what an evolutionary view would say is, look, if you go back far enough, and maybe you have to go back, you know, literally to like the origin of life or something, where you had one organism that initially, you know, started everything off. So according to modern evolutionary theory, you have this thing called LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, that is supposed to be ancestral to all living species, all living organisms. And if you go back far enough, yes, you can reduce all of life, or, all the species, to just, one or two individuals or something like that. So the idea would be, though, that eventually, that population blew up and got very big. And we've sort of just had this large population that's been evolving over time. And that population diverged. So at some point, that population split into a group that led to, say, modern monkeys, and another lineage that led to, modern apes and also modern humans. And then eventually that lineage that led to apes and humans had a split where, some of the individuals would have been, ancestral to the modern apes, and some of the individuals would have been ancestral to modern humans. But, at the end of the day, the population was always very large. So it's a large evolving population, and some of the individuals end up being ancestors of descendants that go one way on the tree, maybe towards modern apes, and others end up being ancestral to, us, basically, folks that go the other way towards modern humans. So yeah, eventually you would have to get back to two, but the idea is that this population has been very large for a very long time, and that gives plenty of time to evolve this large degree of genetic diversity in modern humans. But we now know that that argument is wrong. You can account for modern human genetic diversity coming from just two individuals. If you want to model it that way, we call it a bottleneck. But basically, if you want to model it as just two individuals, you can do that if they lived essentially, far enough back to allow for time for that diversity to then arise. And there's different ways of doing that calculation as well. We can get into that.
So one thing that I noticed was absent from this that got a lot of buzz several years ago was the whole idea of Y chromosome Adam and mitochondrial Eve. And I don't see that discussed here at all. So tell me, did that fall by the wayside? Did that become unpopular? What happened there?
Sure. I mean, I think that most mainstream scientists and pretty much everybody believes that you can actually trace all human beings back to a single female from whom all of our mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondria are an organelle that contain basically another molecular machine called ATP synthase that's responsible for generating the energy molecule of ATP in your cells. And so mitochondria are inherited only from the mother. They are an organelle that exists in the cytoplasm of a cell. So basically, they come from the egg of the mother, and the mitochondria are inherited matrilineally. And so you can trace essentially all human beings came eventually, if you go back far enough, from one female whose mitochondria are ancestral to all living humans. And then for Y chromosomal Adam, the idea is that eventually, if you go back far enough, there will be one human male from whom all Y chromosomes are descended. Okay, of course, it's diversified, but you can have traces back to one male. The reason why that topic is not super relevant to the debate over Adam and Eve is that no mainstream evolutionary scientist would say that Y chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve had to have lived at the same time in the same place and actually mated with each other and were like the initial couple. They might say that, okay, well, maybe this ancient female Eve that we're all descended from, maybe she lived, I don't know, 300,000 years ago. I'm making these numbers up right now. And maybe Y chromosomal Adam lived at 150,000 years ago. So they would not necessarily say that this was like they were actually a couple together at the same time. Now, they could have been. I think that it's fair to say that they could have been a couple. And so it certainly is not inconsistent with the biblical view that we all are descended from an initial couple. So it certainly doesn't rule out that possibility. But in the mainstream view, nobody is saying that they had to be a couple. And so for that reason, I don't take the argument further than the mainstream view would take it. Yeah.
All right, good. Well, okay, that's good. Thanks for clarifying that, because I had forgotten about that. That was a big thing, 10, 15 years ago, reading about it in various journals and stuff. Okay, we've kind of started going into some of the views. So we'll start with the views that maybe are, we might say, more mainstream science friendly views. And we've already touched on, I think, the first one, which you call in the article, and I think the viewers will be familiar with these terms, the theistic evolution or evolutionary creationism view. And this is the view, by and large, promoted by Francis Collins, BioLogos, Dennis Venema, and McKnight, who I think are still members of BioLogos, or at least they were for a long time. So run us through the basics of the theistic evolutionary creationism view.
Sure. So this view basically takes the standard mainstream evolutionary view of human origins, that we share a common ancestor with apes, that humans evolved as a very large population of thousands of individuals, and that this evolution took place through strictly, essentially, standard evolutionary mechanisms: random mutation, natural selection, genetic drift, a suite of mechanisms that standard, evolutionary models invoke that operate in an unguided manner. Okay, so maybe they would say that God is overseeing it, controlling it in some sense, but as far as we could tell from our scientific evidence, they would say there's no evidence for, intelligent intervention, divine oversight of God's involvement. It's something that they believe for theological reasons, but there's no actual scientific evidence for it. So essentially they would say that, it appears to have been unguided. That's the way Francis Collins puts it in the language of God. It would have appeared to have been an unguided process. And so it's just a standard evolutionary view.
Yep.
And then they will say, and by the way, this is the way that we believe God did it.
Right. And they can say maybe add in some kind of front-loaded view where, God creates the initial conditions and then everything unfolds. But on this view, there's no real ability for us to detect anything like God's action in the history of evolution. Right.
That's a really key point.
You just have to posit it as a theological speculation.
That's a really key point, Anthony. In fact, you can read articles on the BioLogos website that will say things like, the evolutionary creationism view does not have much apologetic value because they don't think that they can give you any reason to believe in God from the biological evidence. Okay. They don't see any evidence of sort of an intelligent agent being involved because it's the standard evolutionary view. It all happens on its own. And as far as them believing that sort of maybe life was front loaded, say at the origin of life, I don't want to speak for everybody. I'm sure there's definite, very wide variety of different views, but you do get some folks in the theistic evolution community who are essentially theistic chemical evolutionists. And they would basically take the view that, you have to go back to the very initial conditions of the universe that God set up to allow for life to eventually evolve. But they would say that life actually formed naturally. I know folks in the theistic evolutionary creationist community who take that view and basically believe that the whole shebang goes back to the initial conditions of the universe. And if you look at the universe from the moment it was created, it all was just natural processes all the way down. And turtles all the way down. No, this would have been natural mechanisms all the way down. Yes, God set it up, but from what we can tell, it's just natural stuff happening.
Right. I think that was was it Howard Van Til who had an argument view like that? So you might say that on this view, there's no divine interaction after the initial conditions are unleashed, right? Until I guess, when the Bible starts talking about miracles, and then maybe they would count, they're going to countenance. And we're not going to say that these folks don't believe in the resurrection or Jesus's miracles or even some of the miracles in the Old Testament, but everything up to our historical accounts of miracles, especially in the Bible, there really is there's no direct interaction with God and his creation. God is pretty or almost completely hands off in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair statement. Now, they certainly would say they believe in the miraculous resurrection of Christ. So let's be very clear on that. We're not saying that they are full-blown naturalists, but when it comes to the origin and creation of life, they would say that God basically used natural evolutionary mechanisms, and that's how he did it. And there's no way to detect any evidence for, intelligent design through a sort of a scientific empirical study of nature. That they would certainly say that.
There's no design argument there.
Not from life. Yeah.
Not from life.
It's interesting that they use the same kind of terminology. It would appear that God was involved. It's simply an appearance, which is the same kind of terminology that Dawkins uses in The Blind Watchmaker. There's an appearance of design, but it's not really true. And where the tension falls is that first of all, this was the project of Darwin. This was the project of evolution, was to try and say, we don't need God. We can get there on our own. And it seems to me, as Dawkins and those others define evolution, random, purposeless, unguided, they're reinforcing concepts that seem to sit, again, in tension with the scriptures. How can you have someone crafted in the image of God if it's an unguided, purposeless, and random institution? It just seems to fight against the very position they're trying to hold.
Well, look, this is getting a far field from the idea of intelligent design, but I can give you my own personal views. I am a Christian. I mean, I agree with you what you just said 100%, Lenny. It's very insightful. Richard Dawkins has this famous quote where he says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So Dawkins admits that living things appear designed. He just thinks they weren't really designed, that natural selection and natural evolutionary processes did the designing. Well, then you get the theistic evolutionists who say, well, actually, it doesn't appear designed. So you get the atheists who are saying that it appears designed, but it wasn't. And then here's a quote from Francis Collins in The Language of God. He says, from our perspective, living it as it is by the tyranny of linear time, this would appear a random and undirected process. So Francis Collins, this leading theistic evolutionist, is saying that it doesn't appear designed, but it really was. Okay. So it's like that we're in this surreal world where the atheists are saying it looks designed, but it wasn't. But then these theistic evolutionist Christians are saying it doesn't appear designed, but it really was. Intelligent design, basically avoids this whole sort of incoherent position that these people are having and saying, it looks designed because it really was designed. We don't have to say it was designed, but it doesn't look designed, or it wasn't designed and it does look designed. We can say, no, the reason it looks designed is because it really was designed. You can trust what your eyes are seeing. You can trust what the empirical evidence shows. And as you said, Lenny, that of course is very consistent with the Judeo-Christian view that we were created in the image of God, and that there is, sort of the hand of God seen in the origin of humanity. And it's not just sort of, it doesn't appear that we were produced by a, quote, random and undirected process, as Francis Collins says. It appears that we were designed for a purpose. And you can trust both the science and theology. They fit together very nicely. I think that's a much more intellectually satisfying reconciliation of these ideas than the theistic evolution view or the atheistic evolution view.
Right. So that's great. So just to hit the nail on the head here. On this view, you have basically what we might call the problem of evil and suffering right from the get-go, right out the gate on this view, because there's what's designed, it's random, and then of course you're going to talk about the long history of evolution and predation and species going in and out of existence, and basically God is designing, or God has brought into existence something that's kind of grotesque, I guess at the end of the day. And you don't have any Adam and Eve. You don't have a historical Adam and Eve. So biblically speaking, you're going to have to, on this view, interpret Genesis almost exclusively figuratively or symbolically, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, you've got these tensions between how does God guide an unguided process of evolution,
right?
And and then you've also got the issue of human origins, which I do think is probably where modern evolutionary theory comes into most direct tension with sort of traditional theological views, is where did humans come from? And the classical theistic evolutionary creationist model on that question goes 100% with what the evolutionary view says, and basically tries to then reshape theology to fit with the evolutionary view. And if there are tensions, then theology loses and evolution wins. That's basically the way they approach that dynamic.
So give us some of the scientific evidence and the more recent scientific evidence that would potentially undercut this view. Not so much the tension with the biblical data, but what from the scientific community now is showing is problematic for the theistic evolution view.
Sure. So I mean, as I say in the paper, one of the benefits of the theistic evolution view is that it's fully compatible with mainstream evolutionary science. However, if the scientific evidence actually doesn't support that view, doesn't support the idea that humans share a common ancestor with apes, that we evolved from ape-like ancestors, and that we evolved through strictly unguided natural mechanisms, then that's really not a benefit. Because at the end of the day, we want to be reconciling our theology with good science. And if the best science doesn't support the evolutionary view, then we don't want to waste time trying to reconcile our theology with the evolutionary model. And so from my perspective, when I've looked at the mainstream scientific literature, what I see is admissions that there is, quote, a large unbridged gap unquote. This is from Ernst Mayr, one of the leading architects of the modern synthesis of evolution. He said there's a large unbridged gap between the human-like members of the genus Homo and our supposed Australopithecine ancestors. And another paper in the Journal of Molecular Biology and Evolution said that this large unbridged gap requires a, quote, genetic revolution, unquote, since, quote, no Australopithecine species is obviously transitional. And there was a commentator about this data that said that this implies a, quote, Big Bang model of human origins. And so there was another article or a book chapter by 3 Harvard paleoanthropologists where they said that the transition from Australopithecus to Homo, the supposed, point in the fossil record where the human-like body plan evolves from its ape-like Australopithecine precursors. And they say that this transition is, quote, undoubtedly one of the most critical in its magnitude and consequences. But they admit that, quote, many details of this transition are obscure because of the paucity in archaeological records. And we go on from basically, mainstream evolutionary scientists admitting that this key point in the fossil record where the human-like body plan supposedly evolves, we don't have fossils documenting that evolutionary transition. We don't see evidence for that transition in the fossil record, okay? So for me, when you look at the fossil evidence, we don't see compelling evidence that humans evolved from ape-like precursors. As for the genetics, we talked about that a little bit earlier, but this claim that, we are 98.8% or 99 or whatever percent similar to chimpanzees simply is not true. Some of the best estimates of human genetic similarity to chimps, I would say, are between 84 and 96%, but it's important to understand that all current versions of the chimp genome used the human genome as scaffolding when they built those drafts of the chimp genome. And even the NCBI admits that this effectively humanizes chimp versions of the chimp genome and makes them appear more similar to the chimp genome than they actually are. So when we look at the actual percent genetic similarity is probably going to end up being somewhere between 84 and 96%. But my question would be, what does the percent genetic similarity even say about our common ancestry with apes?
Right.
Because intelligent agents will regularly reuse parts that work in different designs and different systems. Okay, so we see that wheels are reused on both cars and airplanes, or keyboards are reused on both tablets and cell phones. If you're a computer programmer, I had to write thousands of lines of computer code during my PhD. And what I learned very quickly is that computer programmers will often reuse code that works in different programs. Every version of Windows is built upon a previous version of Windows, where they're basically stealing and borrowing code. And so it's a good design principle to reuse functional parts and functional coding modules in different systems. So the fact that we share a lot of functional genetic similarities with chimpanzees could reflect common design as much as it reflects common descent.
Right.
Well, then the immediate rejoinder to this is, what about junk DNA?
Junk DNA.
The idea that most of our genome is not actually functional. It's useless genetic garbage. And because we share some of that quote unquote junk DNA with chimps and other species, doesn't that show that we share a common ancestor with those species? Because God would never put, or no designer would put into our genomes this useless, functionless junk DNA in the same places in our genomes. That's much better explained by random mutations producing that junk in a common ancestor, which we then inherited from the common ancestor. Well, look, I would agree with the logic of the argument. If our genome is largely genetic junk, then it actually does make more sense to explain the genetic similarities that we share with chimps through common ancestry. The problem with the argument is that there has been basically a paradigm shift. A paper in Bioessays just came out recently calling it a paradigm shift over the last 10 or 15 years away from the idea of junk DNA. And it is now widely recognized in the scientific community that essentially the idea of junk DNA was wrong, that the vast majority of our genome is in fact functional. In fact, there was an article in the journal Genome Biology and Evolution a couple years ago, which said that the days of junk DNA are over. And this really started in around 2012, when a huge consortium of hundreds of biologists around the world published a set of papers in Nature and other journals. They were called the ENCODE Project papers. And they looked at the non-protein coding regions of the human genome. And in this set of papers, they found that over 80% of the human genome shows evidence of biochemical functionality. This stands in stark contrast from what many evolutionary scientists have said. For example, Francis Collins, in The Language of God, said that some 45% of our genome is, quote, flotsam and jetsam. What is flotsam and jetsam? That's trash that floats in the ocean, okay? Dennis Alexander, a leading theistic evolutionist with the Faraday Institute in the UK, he wrote in his book, Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose, that about 50% of our genome is genetic garbage. Others like Ken Miller, Richard Dawkins have said, Dawkins says at one point in his 2009 book, The Greatest Show on Earth, that some 95% of our genome is junk and doesn't need to be there. And he uses it as an argument against intelligent design. All these guys are using the junk DNA as an argument against intelligent design. We'll contrast those claims with the ENCODE project, finding that over 80% of our genome is functional. And in fact, they predicted that 80% would go to 100% because as we study more and more cell types, they're realizing that certain parts of our genome are only active in certain types of cells at certain stages of the human life cycle. And they said, as we study more and more DNA, we're going to find that up to 100% of our DNA has function. And so I could go on and on about this, but basically the idea of junk DNA, which is a favorite argument against intelligent design and for human-ape common ancestry, has basically turned out to be wrong.
Okay. That's great. So you gave us three strikes, scientific strikes against the theistic evolution view. One is the gaps in the fossil records. Second was the genetic similarity between chimps and human beings, which seems to be going down. And third is this idea, well, why would God use junk, put what seems to be junk DNA into two different types of organisms if they hadn't shared a common ancestor, and that junk DNA is turning out to be functional DNA, which would then point to something more like common design or usage than common descent. Okay, good. Let's move on.
But if I can say one other thing, there's also the argument that human genetic diversity was too great to account from just two individuals.
From the bottleneck of two. Yeah.
The bottleneck of two.
Yeah.
And we've got the work of Richard Buggs, but I also want to highlight the work of Ann Gager, one of my colleagues here at Discovery Institute, with a mathematician named Ole Hössjer. They published a series of 3 papers in a peer-reviewed journal, Biocomplexity. They developed a model where they basically showed that you could have modern human genetic diversity coming from an initial pair of just 2 individuals if they lived around 500,000 years ago. And this was a really great study that they did. And they put out a detailed population genetics model to demonstrate this. Now, what they said, though, and also Joshua Swamidass should get some credit. He also did a similar study where he found a similar result that about 500,000 years ago, you could account for human genetics diversity if Adam lived at that time. And what Ann Gager and Ole Hössjer found is that you could actually have Adam and Eve living much more recently if you were willing to sort of question more evolutionary parts of the model. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, well, let's do this. Let's finish off one more of these theistic evolution views, which is Dennis Alexander's view. And it's just sort of a nuance to the Francis Collins, Dennis Venema view, but you call it, or he calls it, the Homo Divinus view. So just give us real quick, because there's not great variation between these two views. What is Alexander's view there?
Yeah, this view, great. God, we can talk about this view, was actually originally promoted by the theologian John Stott, and also the Old Testament scholar Derek Kidner. Sort of had an idea that there might have been a population of hominids out there, and then God just chose 2 of them to be Adam and Eve. So this model allows this population of hominids to fully evolve through standard evolutionary mechanisms. God does not specially create Adam and Eve. He just picks basically two dudes out of this population of hominids and says, oh, you are sort of the federal heads of the human species. Right. And you are basically the political leaders or the spiritual leaders of the human species. And you're going to be, he just chose 2 Neolithic farmers basically to be the head of the human species. And he maybe he puts a soul into them, and they're the first ones that can worship God and really, have like modern human relationship with God.
So that, it sounds obviously it sounds fairly ad hoc. Just to say, well, okay, we need an Adam and Eve somehow, so we'll just have God specially select 2 out of the population of 10 to 20 and say,
it seems to try to resolve the question on original sin, because obviously in the theistic evolutionary model, you don't have a fall. You don't have that. So this seems to try to cover that, but it's still offered. The Imago Dei issue is still,
but it still wouldn't explain the existence of pain and suffering prior to God selecting that couple out of the 10 to 20,000
Right.
hominids, right? Unless
Pain
we
and suffering
talk about
for humans.
retroactive causation or some kind of backward causation, which maybe we'll get into in one of the later views.
Yeah.
And under that view, you have basically a standard evolutionary origin of humans. So to the extent that an evolutionary origin of humans has scientific problems, those are incorporated into this model. But then, you don't have Adam and Eve being specially created by God, and they are in no way ancestral to the rest of humanity. They are not even ancestral in any sense necessarily to all of us. They just were two people that God chose and said, you're the head, and they're not then ancestral to the rest of humanity.
Right. And then we want to avoid some of the other, we can do another time on theological issues, but that would certainly take out anything like a tradition view of sin, where sin would then just have to be imputed sort of for every new human that comes along. It's almost like God would put in the stain of sin directly, which I never liked.
You know what, Tony? One of the things that strikes me about this that we don't talk about, if I was living in, let's say, the 3rd century, is it really starts to strike at the concept of why the Son needed to be embodied. The whole necessity of the humanity of Christ and how his humanity then also saves all of us. When you start, especially with the theistic evolutionary models, you start to say there's nothing special about being human. And why did Jesus have to be fully God and fully man? And you can actually start teasing that out. I know that's a discussion for another day, but it really bothers me that as you play it out, as you tease it along, it can actually undercut a lot of the church council's demands that Jesus be both,
fully God and fully man.
It allows the Gnostic heresy to thrive, really.
No, that's a good point. We'll have to deviate on that some other time. Okay, and when we point out problems with the Homo Divinus view, we're not saying anything bad about John Stott, just so everybody knows, who was a great man, great Christian. All right.
We're not saying that any of these people are not Christians.
No,
they're just we might disagree with
Derek Kidner, who was a great exegete himself. No, we're not saying anything bad, but we're just pointing out the problems with some of the views and where they might not quite match up. All right, so now let's get into kind of, I think, is sort of some of these middle ground views. Okay. We've mentioned Ann Gager, and I'm going to mess up his name, the Swedish gentleman. I think he's Swedish. Is he Swedish or Norwegian?
I believe Swedish.
Hössjer? Is Hössjer good?
I think that's right, but I'm probably going to mangle it too. So all right.
I'll use my German pronunciation, say Hössjer, and I hope that's good enough. So we have Joshua Swamidass's view. We'll talk about William Lane Craig's view now, the Homo Heidelbergensis view, and then the unique origins model of Gager and Hössjer. But so where do you want to start, Casey? Where do you think of those three views, who should we start with first?
Well, in the paper, I go through the genealogical Adam and Eve view of Joshua Swamidass first, or of those three views first. So maybe there, yeah.
All right, let's talk about Swamidass's view then, the genealogical Adam and Eve.
Sure. So if you read Joshua Swamidass's book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, published by InterVarsity Press Academic in 2019, it's a very interesting book. It's an interesting idea, but basically his model adopts a fully standard evolutionary model of human origins with one important exception, and that is the special creation of Adam and Eve. So in his view, basically modern humans are descended from a population composed of tens of thousands of individuals who arose via standard evolutionary mechanisms. We share a common ancestor with apes, et cetera, plus two individuals who are miraculously created. So basically at some point in the past, and I think Joshua says it could have been, even 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, or maybe further back, if that's the way you want to see it. At some point in the past, you've got this population of fully evolved hominids, and then God specially creates Adam and Eve, and their offspring basically interbreed with this population of fully evolved hominids. And eventually you and I are the product of that interbreeding of this fully evolved population of hominids plus Adam and Eve's offspring. They all interbreed and they create us. And so because of this, I don't know if you've ever done Ancestry, but you can say that, like a third of the world is descended from Genghis Khan, right? I actually did my own genealogical tracing, and I trace back to William the Conqueror, who invaded and conquered England in 1066.
Cool.
But so, I don't know, but I think like half of England, something like that, is also descended from William the Conqueror. So it's really not that amazing. But in any case, the reason why is because if you go back far enough, the average person who had children is actually, potentially ancestral to a huge percentage of the population, especially somebody prominent like that. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the way that the population genetics math works, it's not hard for this to happen. So what Joshua sort of had this insight that if you had Adam and Eve living far back enough, then, God could have specially created them, and they could have been ancestral to all living humans. Now, there are some problems with this view. Number one, it adopts a standard evolutionary model. So to the extent that the evidence does not support a standard evolutionary model, we don't need to sort of waste time trying to, fit Adam and Eve with a standard evolutionary view. Now, I do know of one person, John Garvey, who has taken sort of an older creationist version of the genealogical Adam and Eve, where he believes that those hominids were specially created, and then God also then later specially created Adam and Eve and allowed, their offspring to interbreed. So it's sort of almost an older creationist twist on the genealogical Adam and Eve model. But this idea has not really been explored much yet, so I'm not going to go into that very much. But suffice to say that when most of us hear of the Swamidass genealogical Adam and Eve model, it's an evolutionary model. And that's the model that he put forth in his book. So we're going to treat it like that right now. And so to the extent that the evolutionary view is not supported by the evidence, we don't need to figure out how to merge Adam and Eve with that view. But I think there are also some sort of theological concerns. Although on the plus side, you have Adam and Eve being specially created under his model. On the negative side, they are not our sole ancestors. Okay. And most folks would say that, Adam and Eve were not just our ancestors, they were our sole progenitors. Mm-hmm. So for example, in Genesis, when God creates Eve, she is called the mother of all the living. Okay. Mm-hmm. And that's the name she's given. Well, under the genealogical Adam and Eve model, Eve is not the mother of all the living at the time that she's created. In fact, that's a specific main feature of the model, is that Eve does not become the mother of all the living for thousands of years and untold numbers of generations. So Eve is not the mother of all living humans for a long time. Now, Swamidass says that by the time Jesus arises and Jesus lives on the earth and dies for the sins of humanity, at that point in time, you could say that all humans who were alive were, if you go back far enough, had Adam and Eve in their genealogical history. Okay. And we're descended from Adam and Eve. So he says that at the time Jesus died, everybody who was alive had inherited the original sin from Adam and Eve and needed Jesus to die for their sins. Okay, so he's trying to be orthodox in that sense. But at the same time, you have all these other humans.
Well, Christian Orthodox, not necessarily Jewish Orthodox, because
okay, yeah,
fair
enough. But but you have all these other humans throughout history who were not descended from Adam and Eve, and he calls them biological humans, not necessarily textual humans. There's no mention of these people in the Bible, as far as I can tell, and we don't know. Were they made in the image of God? Did they sin against God? Did they need to be redeemed? What's the deal? It opens up a lot of sort of, I would say, somewhat disturbing theological implications. For the vast majority of human history, you may have had a huge number of people who were not actually made in the image of God in the same way that Adam and Eve were. What does that mean? I mean, it just is a really weird thing. And so I have some theological concerns and on this model as well. But my main point would be this: look, if the evolutionary view is not correct, then we don't need to worry about trying to figure out how to reconcile Adam and Eve with the evolutionary view. In fact, if you think about it, one of the main reasons I think that this model was originally developed was because if you have this large population of hominids that Adam and Eve interbred with, then you can have all of their genetics being inherited by modern humans. But as we've already seen, we don't need to do that. We can account for all of modern day genetic diversity through just two individuals. We don't need a population of evolved hominids to do that anymore. So one of the main reasons I think for adopting this model to explain where all the modern day human genetic diversity came from, we don't need the genealogical Adam and Eve model to be able to do that. We can account for that if we take a traditional view of humanity being descended from just two individuals. So I just don't see a lot of reasons to adopt the genealogical Adam and Eve model, and it opens up a lot of questions that I think are kind of troubling.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I heard Swamidass at some point reference the part about people being outside the garden when Cain is complaining to God about what might happen to him once he's dispelled from the garden, and these could be, other humans. But I think, that seems to be a significant worry there, that you have sort of bifurcated ontology of these very other kinds of human creatures existing for a long period of time. I mean, what are these? And I think, to move into the next model, I think this is kind of Craig's concern, because he's going to go with the early bottleneck of an original couple, and we'll move into the Homo Heidelbergensis, which is William Lane Craig's more recent view, and that these are human beings. I mean, these ancient hominids are human beings. They have all the sort of necessary capacities and stuff, the things we would see to make them fully fledged human beings. But go ahead, Lenny.
Well, one thing that we hadn't touched on, and if you could just do so quickly, is we haven't talked about retroviruses yet, because sometimes people will point to those as an additional proof for any of these evolutionary models. And the idea that there are viruses that our bodies had caught, our ancestors had caught, that while they are no longer effective, they still reside in our DNA, and that can be problematic as well. Can you comment on those?
Yeah, sure. I talk about these in my paper as well. They kind of fall under the junk DNA category. It's the idea that there are certain elements of our genome where, maybe most of the genome is functional, but what about endogenous retroviruses, or what about pseudogenes? And these are said to be basically specific genetic elements, which in the case of endogenous retroviruses, they are supposed to be basically ancient viral infections that got incorporated into our genomes. And we have them, apes have them. And if we all have them, is that evidence, again, that this is junk DNA that shows our common ancestry? Well, the reality is that we have found many papers that have uncovered function for endogenous retroviruses, or ERVs as they are called. And so I would say that the argument that they are just functionless junk DNA, really, that the jury's out on this. We have found many functions for these, including gene regulatory roles. And we've also found that the reasons why they might resemble immune functions in many cases might be, the reason why they might resemble viruses is because they have immune functions that are actually related to fighting off viral infections. So I think there's other ways to look at these ERVs. Pseudogenes are another similar example. Pseudogenes are supposed to be basically genes that were once functional, but then essentially incurred mutations, which rendered them non-functional. And here again, we see that there are many examples of pseudogenes which are turning out to have function. In fact, there is one prominent example. It was testified during this court case over intelligent design years ago that it was a quote unquote broken gene that we shared with apes, and that shows our common ancestry. Well, a couple years ago, there was an article that was published that found that this quote unquote pseudogene is actually indispensable for making human red blood cells. Okay, so we're finding out that these pseudogenes are also not simply non-functional DNA. And again, they all have the same sort of rhetorical, argument dynamic, where it was assumed for evolutionary reasons that this is useless genetic garbage. And then it turns out we're discovering that they have function. So I just don't think that these ERV, pseudogene, or other junk DNA arguments are good horses to bet on. The evidence is not trending in their direction.
Well, as human beings, we continually speak too soon, don't we? Putting our foot in our mouth constantly. That's good. Let me do this before we get into the fourth and the fifth views here, which again is the Heidelbergensis view and then Gauger and Hössjer's view. So on the theistic evolutionary view, you don't have a historical Adam and Eve. You got to take it as symbolic, allegorical. On the Homo Divinus view of Alexander and Stott, you get sort of an ad hoc God just picks. You have a historical Adam and Eve, but they're not the progenitors of all humanity. They're just sort of picked out and are sort of federal representatives for humanity. Now, on Swamidass's view, you have a historical Adam and Eve. They're created de novo. They are the progenitors of all human beings come sort of the time of Jesus, because their everybody would be ancestrally related to them. But you have all these other human creatures that were genetically descended from, and we don't, and we're related to them, but we really don't kind of know what to make of these other hominid-like creatures that are not Adam and Eve, or not descended from Adam and Eve. There's some kind of other thing. And then, so now we're going to go into Craig's view, which goes all the way back to the bottleneck of an original historic Adam and Eve. So let's go into that view.
Yeah, by the way, before we get into this, I do want to note I'm not saying that we've discovered functions for every single ERV or every single pseudogene. There's still a lot we don't know about the genome, right. And, we need to keep an open mind. I'm just saying that, the evidence is not trending in that direction, and we should not prematurely conclude things here.
Yeah,
okay.
Right.
William Lane Craig's view, very, very interesting model. He first of all looks at Swamidass's view, the genealogical Adam and Eve view, where basically Adam and Eve's progeny are interbreeding with these hominids that are descended from a common ancestor with apes and are sort of, essentially like animals. William Lane Craig is concerned about that view. He basically says it's tantamount to bestiality, that you have humans interbreeding with these non-human, essentially, animal type things. And so he does not like that view. So he wants to have Adam and Eve basically being, just two individuals who were all descended from, and that God put the soul into. Now, his view is sometimes difficult to understand exactly where he's coming from. Sometimes he does allow some interbreeding between Adam and Eve's progeny and the other hominids. Sometimes he, it's not exactly clear. But I think my best reading of his view is that you have Adam and Eve who were in fact descended from a common ancestor with apes. Okay. So Adam and Eve were in fact descended from a common ancestor with apes, but they were two individuals who God basically put a soul into, and we are descended from just those two individuals. It's kind of like a true genetic bottleneck. And he thinks that they lived around 750,000 years ago, and were members of the species Homo heidelbergensis, which is very, very, very similar to modern humans in many respects. And so I don't have a problem with the idea that something like Homo heidelbergensis could have been Adam and Eve, because Homo heidelbergensis essentially looked and maybe even thought a lot like a modern human. Okay. So they may really not have been that much different from you and me, if different at all. So I don't have a real problem with that potential idea that something like Homo heidelbergensis represented what Adam and Eve were. Where I would question his model is the idea that this Adam and Eve, this Homo heidelbergensis Adam and Eve, had to have shared a common ancestor with apes. Okay. And again, the main argument that William Lane Craig cites in favor of that common ancestry is pseudogenes. Okay. And pseudogenes, in my opinion, and I think there's a lot of literature to back up this view, is pseudogenes are not simply looking like they are functionless junk DNA that represent our, inherited junk that we inherited from a common ancestor with apes. They look like they are largely functional. And because of that, they could be the result of common design. They're functional genetic elements that were designed as part of the human genome. And so I don't think that he has a very strong argument if he relies upon junk DNA pseudogenes to indicate that we share a common ancestor with apes. Otherwise, though, I do find the possibility that something like Homo heidelbergensis could have been Adam and Eve to be plausible. And I like the idea that he's trying to have Adam and Eve be the, quote, sole genetic progenitors, unquote, of humanity, where there's just the two of them who basically are ancestral to all of modern humans. But he doesn't believe that they were specially created. Okay, I want to make that really clear.
They're not created from the earth.
Not created. Yeah. Well, look,
right.
I mean,
or de novo, just de novo. Yeah.
And this is where his book is sometimes not always clear where exactly he stands. But at the end of the day, when he is trying to adopt and basically merge an evolutionary view with Adam and Eve, he is not endorsing a special creation, a de novo origin of Adam and Eve. At least that's the way my best reading of his book. Yeah.
And to be fair with Craig, because I've heard him on this and talk about it and a lot of things, he will tell you that he's not really advocating for this position in his book. In other words, he's not planting his flag on here and making a stand. He's asking a question is the way he will pose it. It makes sense to him. It's how we can put things in order. For example, there's the secondary problem of the Neanderthal and the fact that we have Neanderthal genetics within us. So, but if human beings and Neanderthals shared Adam and Eve as their common ancestor, that problem goes away. So he's trying to, as a philosopher, what he's trying to put a thought model out there and say, this seems to make sense. I'm not saying this is the way it was, but can we consider it and argue about it?
Yeah, great point, Lenny. He's trying to show that even if you adopt sort of a mainstream evolutionary view, you could still have Adam and Eve fit in there somewhere. And you make a great point that he, and this is one of the benefits of his model, is that Adam and Eve are living far back enough to be ancestral to species like the Neanderthals or the Denisovans, which we do have very similar DNA to, and we do share DNA with. So this allows them to be descendants of Adam and Eve. And I personally like that aspect of his model. The only thing I really don't like about this is that he rejects sort of the de novo creation of Adam and Eve. I don't think the evidence requires you to do that. But I can see what he's trying to do. And it's an interesting, again, he's come up with interesting ideas.
Yeah. So just to put another term out there. So de novo creation would juxtapose with universal common descent. Universal common descent would be the right term, I think, that human beings were descended from some original form of life that all other biological creatures are also descended from. And that would be contrasted with de novo, from, new novel creation, right? Where and maybe that view could be worked both ways. Maybe you could have a view where Homo heidelbergensis is the de novo Adam and Eve, or they are descended from the universal common descendant ancestor.
Yeah, it really comes down to also, evolutionary mechanisms. To what extent did they play a role in the creation of Adam and Eve, that they arose by just random mutation and natural selection? Craig isn't always totally clear on where he stands on this. Sometimes he seems to allow for maybe, divine intervention in these mutations. Sometimes it seems like he wants to allow for standard unguided evolutionary mechanisms. But yeah, I mean, that's also a juxtaposition here between de novo creation. Yeah.
Well, because that get, and those get into certain metaphysical questions about how God, divine action and stuff. And some philosophers don't like God being too involved in, in natural processes. Others think so. That's something that somebody would adjudicate there. I know, I would think, having interacted with Craig and some of his other books and classes, that what probably is the primary concern for him is that you need the certain kinds of ontological capacities or features, properties there in order for Adam and Eve to have a free will, to be morally responsible agents. Right. So I haven't read the book. I know he talks a lot about sort of the artifacts that we see from these creatures, their creative capacities, their ability to make plans, have intentions, create tools, and so on and so forth, which would give us an indication of the imago Dei, that they also have sort of the cognitive capacities you would want to see in order for them to be able to make a free will and a moral choice, which then could get us into the doctrine of sin and so on and so forth. So I know that's on his mind. Okay, so maybe somewhat related to this then is Gager and Hössjer's view. So let's go into that next, which I think you call the unique origins model.
Yeah, and really quick before we get into that, aside from the sort of the evolutionary aspects of William Lane Craig's model, I find it actually plausible and innovative to propose that Adam and Eve could have been Homo heidelbergensis. I'll let you guys sort out some of the theological issues there, but I think that scientifically speaking, I liked his ideas in that respect. So I actually am not totally against that model. I think he's got some good ideas.
I think the main issue always, Casey, on most all these views is how can you have evil and how can you have pain and suffering prior to a moral fall, a fall of man making a decision to, break fellowship with God that then introduces evil into the world, and then of course, there's a spiritual realm there as well that maybe one can have played out. But I think this is going to be always the crux of the issue, is how can you have all this animal pain and suffering and species going in and out of existence and predation and things like that prior to some kind of human action. Right.
That is a big issue. My article did not really get into that. I'm not a theologian. I don't feel like I'm the right person to turn to for answers on that. Of course, I have my own views, but they're just a lay person's views, So, but yeah,
I don't know if there's any answer to that, until we get to have,
maybe so. Yeah,
we know.
But I think there are multiple plausible ways to resolve it. I think we're not without potential ways to resolve the issue at all. Anyway, but yeah.
Okay, so the unique origins model by Gauger and Hössjer. That's where we're at now. Yeah.
Yes. So this is a model that was developed by Anne Gauger and Ola Hössjer, who are intelligent design proponents. And they didn't try to put forth a full-fledged theological model of Adam and Eve. What they tried to show is that it is possible for Adam and Eve to have, for humanity to be descended from an initial pair of just two individuals if they lived as far back as about 500,000 years ago. And they did sort of break off from a standard evolutionary model, and that they proposed that these two initial individuals were given what they called primordial diversity. So they're sort of designed with a large amount of diversity, genetic diversity into their initial genomes. And then they showed that if you just assume standard evolutionary mechanisms after the point of their origin, you could then account for modern day human genetic diversity without needing to invoke any miracles or sort of just standard biological mechanisms. They do point out, though, however, in their paper that if you're willing to question sort of more standard biological mechanisms after these initial two are originated. Oh my, we're getting a Amber Alert right now. This is the test of the National Wireless Emergency Alert System. I'm getting that. Okay, I'm going to silence my phone here. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure everybody's getting
I was
this right
wondering
now.
when that was going to come because I was reading about it this morning. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thought, this is going to come right in the middle of our interview. And lo and behold.
There we go. Okay. Thankfully, the world is not ending, at least not today. At least we don't think so. So anyway, they basically say, but if you're willing to question more standard biological mechanisms of population dynamics, then you could actually have Adam and Eve living a lot earlier than that, perhaps as recent as 100,000 years ago. And so one of the, I think, benefits of their model is that it explains modern day human genetic diversity. Another benefit is that it has Adam and Eve living far enough back where, again, like the Homo Heidelbergensis model, Adam and Eve could be ancestral to the Neanderthals or the Denisovans. So now those other hominids are not sort of people outside the garden, so to speak. They actually are descendants of Adam and Eve. And so that allows us to explain very easily, from a theological view, what were these other hominids that looked a lot like modern humans. So that's sort of the Adam and Eve view from, and I call this the unique origins and design model of Anne Gauger and Ola Hössjer.
Okay, so we have an old Adam and Eve on these last two views, right? But they're historical, they're real, they're a real couple. They're the beginning of the bottleneck, so to say. Everybody's descended from this original pair. They're just relatively far back in history. And
That's
then
right.
on Gauger and Hössjer, they're talking about different ways of thinking about the genetic mechanism itself. There could be a greater amount of genetic diversity at the beginning, right? And then
Yes.
was there also something about maybe mutation rates being different in their view, or
not really? They tried to minimize their deviation from standard biological mechanisms. But if you think about it, we each have two copies of each gene in our bodies. We get one chromosome from one parent and one chromosome from the other parent. So for each gene, we each have two copies of that gene. So if you put Adam and Eve together, between the two of them, there are up to 4 copies of any given gene. So we call those alleles. They would each have 4 alleles. So basically what they're finding is that if you have two individuals with up to 4 copies of, or 4 different versions of each gene, 4 alleles for each gene in their genome, living 500,000 years ago, and then you just allow standard biological mechanisms to take place since that time, then you can account for modern day human genetic diversity. And you can have those two individuals as the sole genetic progenitors of all humanity. That's a very key point you made, Anthony. Thank you for that. Basically, Adam and Eve are our ancestors, and they're our sole ancestors. We don't have Adam and Eve interbreeding with, other hominids. Right. They are our sole ancestors, and they could have been specially created if that's the way you want to look at their model. They allow, that certainly is an allowable part of their model. It's not required, but it's very much allowable in their model.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think we're getting a lot of clarity here because, again, since that thing back to, the Christianity Today article in 11, and then that long debate about, whether there could be a bottleneck in 2017, a lot of these models are either new or being updated pretty quickly. So All right. And then here's one I think that a lot of people will be familiar with, although I don't know all the details of it. You talk about what you term the classical old Earth model, and this would be something that is a model that has been proposed by people like Hugh Ross and Fuzz Rana from Reasons to Believe, who most of our audience will be familiar with. So and there's some variations there, a few different features of this view from the previous two. So let's talk about the classical old Earth model as proposed by Ross, Rana, and Reasons to Believe.
Sure. So under this view, human beings are specially created by God. Okay. So Adam and Eve are specially created by God, and they are the sole genetic progenitors of all living humans. So it's very traditional in that sense. You have special creation. You have Adam and Eve are our sole ancestors. Now, the difference between this view and the unique origins design view is the unique origins design view puts Adam and Eve, or puts this initial couple, they don't call them Adam and Eve, they just say initial couple, around 500,000 years ago. And what that does is that allows this initial couple to have lived around the time, say, roughly speaking, when the human body plan first appears in the hominid fossil record. The old Earth creationist model puts the creation of Adam and Eve much later, around, we'll just say, roughly speaking, around 100,000 years ago. Now, for under this model, the hominid body plan has already been around, or the human-like body plan has already been around in the fossil record for a while. But they choose a date of about 100,000 years ago for Adam and Eve because something special does happen at that point, and that is what has often been called the explosion of modern human-like culture, creativity, art, religion, whatever. So, and it's actually been called the culture explosion, sort of taking off the idea of the Cambrian explosion, that we see this in the archaeological record, this very abrupt appearance of sort of modern human-like intellectual activity and creativity and so forth. And they think that this represents when God first made Adam and Eve in the image of God, with their ability to worship and, think creatively and do art and have very high intellects and all those things. And so one of the benefits of their model is basically they are timing the creation of Adam and Eve with this archaeological evidence for where you get this explosion of modern human-like creativity in the archaeological record. Now, what their model says, though, what about the Neanderthals, these other hominids, or the Denisovans? These other hominids would have already been living for a long time before the creation of Adam and Eve, according to their model. So they would say that these other hominids were specially created separately from Adam and Eve. And then what God was basically doing is he initially created these other hominids to prepare the biosphere, to prepare the environment and the ecosphere, essentially, for the eventual coming of truly modern human Adam and Eve made in the image of God. So God didn't just pop, this very intelligent advanced species in there. That would have been a shock to the biosphere, according to their argument. And the argument is that by creating these pre-human hominids, were very similar to modern humans, but were not made in the image of God, didn't have all of our intellectual abilities just yet. We don't even know if they spoke necessarily, that God was preparing the biosphere for the eventual coming of Adam and Eve and modern humans. And so under this view, the Neanderthals and Denisovans are not descended from Adam and Eve. Now, initially, if you look at some of the early versions of their model, you had no interbreeding between Adam and Eve's progeny and the other hominids, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. But we now have pretty good genetic evidence for interbreeding between, what we call modern humans and Neanderthals. I don't necessarily think there's much of a difference, but we see that there is evidence that we interbred with the Neanderthals. So I think that today, folks like Hugh Ross and Fuzz Rana would probably acknowledge that there was interbreeding, and they would say that this may have been a deviation from God's plan, which is not the first time, in human history that we did things we weren't supposed to do. But there may have been some interbreeding. They don't see it as like, the difference between this and the genealogical Adam and Eve view is in the genealogical Adam and Eve view, interbreeding between Adam and Eve's descendants and these non-human, these sort of made in the image of God hominids. That is a key important part of the way human history was supposed to develop. You had to have lots of interbreedings, and that's why I think William Lane Craig doesn't like it. He calls it bestiality. Yeah. In the old Earth creationist model, there is interbreeding, but it's limited, and it's not necessarily part of God's plan. It's just another example.
Maybe it is bestiality.
Maybe it is bestiality. Yeah, it would be
because
bestiality.
these would be not be humans, they'd be land animals, what the Bible calls the land animals.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sorry. It would be, you're right. It would be bestiality under the old Earth creationist model as well, but it was just something that wasn't supposed to happen. And again, it was not the first time that humans did things they weren't supposed to do.
Right. And these beasts just sort of have human-ish features, but they are not ontological humans. So that might be a sort of a tricky area for that view, is really what to do with the Denisovans and the Neanderthals, who appear to have created at least rudimentary culture, cave paintings, artifacts, things like this. Because I mean, Craig kind of waxes poetically about the Neanderthal and how good looking they were and all this, how there's no way that these couldn't have been, human beings like you and me. But on this view, then for Ross and Rhonda, these are, best like highly functioning land animals, sort of.
Yeah, and truth be told, to be fair to everybody on this, there is debate even among mainstream, paleoanthropologists, evolutionary paleoanthropologists, about the extent to which Neanderthals and Denisovans had art, had culture. You will find some folks who will say, yes, they were very intelligent. They were using complex tools. They buried their dead. They made art. And you will find other folks who will say, no, they didn't. And they question the evidence for art and culture and complex tool use and all of that.
Right.
So, there is the jury is still out as far as like even the mainstream view goes on this exactly. And I think that whether you want to make them be part of modern humans or not, you have evidence on your side either way.
Right.
Yeah. I don't want to be too hard on anybody on this. It's just
no.
Totally
I mean, look, we don't want to get into the hermeneutical question of how we, the problem of interpreting any kind of data.
Well, and to be quite honest with you, my view for a long time was that there was good evidence that they had art and culture and they could probably speak. And I had a very good friend named Dr. Sue Dykes. She actually worked with Reasons to Believe until she tragically passed away a few years ago. And she lived in South Africa when I was there doing my PhD. Mm-hmm. And Sue was brilliant. And I would bring, argument after argument to her as to why the Neanderthals had culture and art and probably needed to be descended from Adam and Eve. And she would knock them down.
Right.
Okay. And she had good arguments in response. And so to be fair, it's just not clear. And I don't think that you can really say we shouldn't be too dogmatic one way or the other.
Right. There's a very limited amount of evidence that you're talking about. And there's a very large amount of braggadocio and of course, there's always this political undertone of wanting these things to be true, because if the Neanderthal, if the Denisovans are like us, but not in our lineage, then it's another cog to pull away from the creationist model. So one person had told me before, and I'm not trying to disparage anybody today, but if you look at the history of paleoanthropology, the number of intentional frauds that have shown up over the last 100 years, it's like, if this was the stock market, all these people would be in jail. Okay. But because it's paleoanthropology, it's a whole different ball game. But there is something to be gained, not merely by taking out the creationists, but because there is, if your name is Leakey, hey, you've made it and you've published and everybody points to you. And so there's that aspect of this as well.
A lot of truth to that. Yeah.
There's a human aspect to it, to be sure. Okay. That's good. So, classical old Earth model, we have, historical Adam and Eve, progenitors. So I'm going to say, like, they're looking at the cultural explosion. So for Ross in here, what they're seeing is the cultural explosion at this later date in history seems to be better evidence for something like a human soul, like an actual human soul. I might put it that way, where Craig wants to, and maybe Gager and Hössjer, I'll put that further back, that no, it looks like we have a fully fledged human soul. And I think this would be like Swinburne's view as well. Swinburne, I think, would go back pretty far. That is very early, right? Very early. Great. Okay.
But underdeveloped. It's there, but underdeveloped.
Yeah. I mean, look, one thinks of, I think it's chapter 5 in Problem of Pain, that Lewis kind of has, he does this imaginative recreation of what he calls pre-Adamic man. and how they would be very simple, but still God's image and likeness, and not confusing the simplicity of human artifacts with what we could tell about the actual inner life of a human.
Right. So you even if you look at Genesis 5, right, where it's Jubal who's the father of all who play the flute. I mean, it's not Adam who's the father of all who play the flute, right? Music comes out several generations beyond.
Right. So, I mean, you could have a fully fledged human soul with moral responsibility and agency and everything before you have any kind of sophisticated artifact.
Right.
Right. Okay. Now we got to shift into the last two views here. And I think one of the things that is going to, so on the scientific end here, that's going to differentiate these views from maybe the others is the question of like dating methods, like radiometric dating methods, because these are going to be more the young Earth creationist views. So let's start with the classical young Earth model. This would be, I guess, proposed by groups like Answers in Genesis or Institute for Creation Research, ICR. So the classical young Earth model, Casey, go.
I'm sure many folks are probably very familiar with this model. It basically says that God created the universe and all kinds of life on Earth in 6 24-hour days. This happens somewhere around 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. And under this view, Adam and Eve were created, at the end of the creation week on day 6, and that would have been around 6 to 10,000 years ago. And under this view, if you want to talk about, what were the Neanderthals, well, they would have just been humans, basically, that got off the ark after the flood or something like that, and they were just basically human beings who lived at some point in the past, and they basically would reject, all the standard ages of these fossils. So if mainstream science says that Neanderthals lived 500,000 years ago, they would reject that. And they would say, no, actually, these fossils are very recent. They're just a few thousand years old. And these represent essentially human beings who were made in the image of God and were descended from Adam and Eve. So they certainly do believe that God specially created Adam and Eve, that Adam and Eve are ancestral to all living humans. And I mean, theologically, they tick all the boxes of sort of traditional theological beliefs. There's a number of areas where they would deviate from mainstream science, but the one that really distinguishes them is in rejecting, the dating methods and the ages of these fossils and believing that everything happened just in the last, 6 to 10,000 years.
Right. So this certainly reconciles with the, taking the biblical genealogies, literally, the idea that Adam and Eve seem to be like Neolithic farmers. Is it Neolithic? But relatively recent in that kind of environment. And then the bottleneck would go back to Noah, because one of the main premises of this view would then be the catastrophic and global flood, which takes out all prior human life. And then the bottleneck is basically Noah and his family. Right.
That's right. Actually, that's a good point. Yeah, that's true.
Although I think RTB doesn't necessarily discount that either. Even though they hold to a regional flood, they might hold that all human beings were destroyed in that flood because humanity
they were only
spread.
in that
right.
area.
But you still get genetic diversity because you have the 3 wives of the 3 sons. So it's not simply a bottleneck of 2. It's a bottleneck of 8.
That's true. That's right. Yeah.
Or 6, I guess, or 5. I don't know how.
You would have Noah, his wife, and then the 3 other wives. So it's in a weird way, it's a bottleneck of 5. Yeah, because the sons represent the diversity of their moms and dads. Yeah.
So Casey, I mean, on this, okay, let's talk briefly. We've been going on for a while. We've covered a lot of ground. Let's talk briefly about some of the dating methods. I mean, what's your position on, this idea that, because on the young Earth model, you have to argue that the dating methods are pretty much fatally flawed, correct?
That is true. Yeah. They do have to argue that. I mean, look, I'm an old earther, so I accept dating methods. I think that there are some places within hominid fossils where the dating methods work less well than others. For example, when you find a hominid fossil in a cave, caves tend to be like washing machines where, water will fill up these caves and stir everything up. It's very hard to do stratigraphy inside of a cave. And because these caves will be filled with water, you will often be leaching minerals or elements chemicals in and out of the minerals that you want to use for dating. So that can often make it very difficult to date things inside of caves. And also it can be very difficult to date, certain artifacts. Like you find a stone tool on the ground. Okay, great. Well, how old is it? Okay, well, there are certain methods you can use to date how long something has been exposed to the sunlight. But a lot of the dating methods that we use for artifacts or hominid bones are difficult to really nail down. That being said, I don't challenge those methods. I'm not here to say those methods are wrong. I'm just saying it can be challenging. So I pretty much accept, the ages of the fossils and the dates of these things. And I just think that it's very difficult to challenge all that. But that being said, I'm not here to, get into that debate today.
Yeah.
I do think that one point I want to bring out is that, what about explaining all of human genetic diversity from an Adam and Eve that lived only, say, 6,000 to 10,000 years ago? And, if you had Ola, Hössjer, and Gager finding that, you had to have them living at least 500,000 years ago, or maybe a little bit younger if you reject some standard biological processes. Well, there is a young Earth creationist geneticist named John Sanford who has done some interesting work on this, where he said, well, look, what if Eve's, not only was her genome, sort of built in with primordial diversity, but if you think about it, at the moment that a baby human female is born, all of her eggs are already, created, or already there in her body from the time that she's born. Obviously, she can't have children until she matures and gets much older, but those eggs are there from the time that she's born. So if that's the case, then if what he assumes is that maybe there was diversity built in to the gametes of Adam and Eve, built into the eggs of Adam and Eve, or the eggs of Eve and the sperm of Adam. And if they lived for very long periods of time and have lots of children, then he thinks that you can explain modern human genetic diversity in just a few hundred generations, which allows him to get around at least the human genetic diversity issue and still having Adam and Eve living only a few thousand years ago. There's still the geological dating issue, and that's a much bigger issue. But I'm just going to say that I do think that they've managed to come up with a model for dealing with human genetic diversity that could work. Yeah.
Okay. What is the estimated number of generations if you were to say take a 10,000-year-old Adam approach? How many generations are they postulating there?
Well, I mean, that depends upon how long you think they're living and at what ages people are having children.
And that's why I'm pulling on this thread, because if you're going to take it that literally, you have very, very long lifespans, 800, 900 years. And so the genetic diversity is actually crippled even more, because we're not talking about reproducing at 15 years old, dying at 30, the way we saw people in past centuries do. We're talking about waiting till you're 500 before you're having the son that is of note, and etc.
I don't know the exact number of generations. I want to say it's on the order of a few hundred. I don't recall.
That's Sanford.
I was just curious.
Yeah. Well, and that we'd have to do our biblical work on numbers in Genesis as well. But there is a model out there, so we should put that out, that there's a model that would work around the problem of the level of diversity in the human genome that we see today. That would be work outable on even the young Earth creationist view. Now, just to wrap things up and to finish it off, you have a one last view that you put up there, which is sort of a hybrid view between the old Earth and the young Earth model. So let's just finish up that one, and then we'll make some concluding remarks.
Sure. And I'm not here today to debate the ages of things. I'll state my view. I've been very open about my view for a long time, but I'm not here to, I'm just trying to describe these views here today. But the last view would be what we call the old Earth, recent humans hybrid model. And under this view, the Earth would be billions of years old, but Adam and Eve were created very recently, maybe 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. There's not a lot of folks out there who've articulated this view, but there are a few books that I've read and found over the years. You can read them if you read my article in the Religions Journal, cites these papers and these books. But basically, it is similar to the young Earth creationist view in that it is going to reject the ages of the hominid fossils. Okay, so even if it accepts dating methods for sort of the rocks that give you a very old Earth, it's going to reject the ages when it comes to hominid fossils, and it's going to say that any evidence of hominids existing beyond 6,000 to 10,000 years ago is not necessarily correct, and Adam and Eve lived very recently. So
Okay.
So, yeah, that's basically this view. Yeah.
Okay. So it would take the methods for, the dating methods as accurate for non-human life. But then when you get to human life, the dating methods are.
No, I think it would take the dating method. So there's a fundamental difference in dating geologic time spans and dating life set forth. So yeah. So and many times one is reliant upon the other. If you bring in a bone for carbon-14 dating, they're going to ask what strata is it found in, for example. So a lot of times they're interdependent, but they know enough and they're sophisticated enough to say the hominids couldn't have lived that long, so we're going to question them. But potassium argon radiation still has a decay rate, and if I'm just studying a rock, that rock may be old. It means the question is whether the layers are appropriately representing those kinds of times.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I mean, for very recently, something that lived very recently, you can use carbon dating. Carbon dating only works to about 50,000 years, even under the conventional view, because once you get too many half-lives, about 10 half-lives of carbon-14, it's below our detection limit. But, if you're going back further than that, you are using essentially radiometric methods, and you usually can't date the fossils directly. You still are dating rocks. You're dating maybe an ash layer below where the fossil is found, and maybe then, a dike or something, that you've, or some other, a sill that intrudes above where the fossil is found. And you're able to then sort of constrain bracket the age of that fossil to between the age of the ash layer and the sill or something like that. And so we're rarely in the fossil record, we're able to date fossils directly. Typically, we are still using radiometric methods, and we're dating rocks, which then give us an age constraint on the fossil record. So yeah. So, I mean, but I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's a million views out there. There's probably people who would say, as you said, Lenny, that, maybe there's all life is very recent, but the rocks are very old. And there's probably some people would say that maybe some life is ancient, but humans are young. There's a lot of different views out there. But this one is just, at least for this, we're just saying that they say that human life is very young. Yeah.
So we've done we've canvassed 8 different models here, Casey, that you lay out in the article. And again, we're going to get the article linked and try and get it out to as many people, because I think, as you said, we're not trying to adjudicate this right now. I mean, but this gives people at least a clear understanding of what are the models, where are their advantages and disadvantages to each, as it relates both to the mainstream science, the not so mainstream science, but what we, maybe the emerging science, and also, our interpretation of the book of Genesis. So you, in the 8, you say that towards the end of the article, you point out that there are 4 that basically assume the standard model of human evolution. Okay. And those are basically the first 4 that you lay out. So just to reiterate for the audience, that's the theistic evolution, the Homo Divinus view, the genealogical Adam and Eve view, and possibly the Homo Heidelbergensis view. If it does it could affirm universal common descent, right? And then the latter 4 would be de novo creation. Right. Those would all be ones that don't accept the idea of a universal common descent, but that posit that Adam and Eve are de novo creation.
Yeah, that's right. Or at least they're compatible with de novo creation. Yeah, that's right. Exactly right. And so I'm obviously, as a proponent of intelligent design, I'll admit my bias is I'm certainly not partial towards the evolutionary models. I think that the evidence for human evolution and common ancestry with apes is just not very strong. And so I think that one of the non-evolutionary views is best. I talked about this in a blog post I wrote, that my view is probably somewhere between the unique origins and design view and the classical old Earth creationist view, are probably the models that I favor. But I try to keep an open mind on these things. And yeah, so but in this paper that I wrote in Religions Journal, I do try to create some tables at the end of the paper, which sort of go through the interaction of each model with the scientific evidence and with traditional theological beliefs. And so, for example, I mean, the standard classical theistic evolution view basically doesn't get any of the traditional theological beliefs. And then some of the evolutionary views do get some of those beliefs. Like at least the Homo Divinus view believes that Adam and Eve were real people who lived and fell into sin. And all the models actually would, other than the classical theistic evolution view, would agree with that. Many of the models would also say that Adam and Eve were ancestral to all living humans. But then really none of the evolutionary views, maybe the whole Homo Heidelbergensis view is the only evolutionary view that would say that Adam and Eve were the sole initial progenitors of all humans. And of course, the non-evolutionary views would all agree that Adam and Eve were the sole initial progenitors of all humans. All of the non-evolutionary views are compatible, or if not, favoring special creation, de novo creation of Adam and Eve. The Homo Heidelbergensis view probably doesn't have that. What distinguishes the genealogical Adam and Eve view is it's the only evolutionary model that really puts an emphasis that, yes, there was special creation of Adam and Eve. And so that's an interesting part of that model. And when you talk about when Adam and Eve lived, obviously the young Earth creationist view and the old Earth recent origin hybrid model, they both would say that Adam and Eve lived, within the last 10,000 years. None of the other models say that except for the genealogical Adam and Eve model again. So it's interesting that model is trying to fuse a, specially created, recently created Adam and Eve with an evolutionary view. Right. Now, of course, the problem there, though, is that they're definitely not the sole initial progenitors of all humans. And so this is where it gets complicated. There's a lot of different ways. These models have different strengths and weaknesses, and some of them are better than others in certain places. When you talk about, the idea of physical death before the fall, the only one that's really clear on not having any physical death before the fall would be the classical young Earth creationist model. Maybe the old Earth recent origin hybrid model, if potentially, I don't know, it depends on who you ask. And then also there's the question of whether or not humans are, imago Dei humans are interbreeding with other humans and essentially committing bestiality. Right. And on this one, most of the models don't have this. Not most of the non-evolutionary models don't have this, but it is probably happening in the genealogical Adam and Eve model. It's probably getting bestiality in the Homo Heidelbergensis model, and you may be getting it in the classical old Earth creationist model. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Well, this, I want to get this article because it clears a lot of stuff, and it gives people a good starting point to start their theological thinking about this issue. And we shared one of the charts there. You got another chart of how the things match up with the current some of the scientific issues. We covered a lot of ground here, but again, this is a great help, I think, to a lot of people who are trying to do some theological anthropology and doctrine of sin here, to at least read and get familiar with some of the points you bring up, and then we'll let people make their own decisions from there. Well, Casey, we've covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate you joining us today, and hopefully we can do it again another time. Maybe we'll hone in on some of these, more specifically on some of these ideas that came up today. But we appreciate your taking the time to be with us this morning.
Thank you for having me, Anthony. It was a long conversation, and I appreciate all the homework you guys did, really digging into this tricky issue, this complicated issue. You guys had a lot of great points you made, and thanks for bringing some really good points out.
All right. Thank you, brother. It was good seeing you. Okay. God bless.